Well, happy Reformation Day. Thank you, Jim. Got feisty on your vacation, did you? But how much do you know about the Reformation? How much do you know about the period of time in which Luther lived? Anybody aware of some of the things? What was the century like? Luther was born in 1483. Now think about that. You know some dates around that. Start thinking about elementary school. There was a year in which Columbus sailed in 1492, 1483. Luther was not very old when navigation of the world was in a very different place. It was a rich time in Western Europe. Advances in navigation had made it possible for ships not to hug the shoreline, but to set themselves a direction out into the open sea, and that advancement made it possible in 1492, when Luther was just an adolescent, for Columbus, as one of those navigators, to come upon a land that is yet unknown to Europeans. It was a rich period, not unlike the advancements of, say, the last century. Then Da Vinci was inventing. Michelangelo was painting and sculpting. Europe's first postal service was designed and began to operate. The first pocket watch was invented. People were all worked up and apocalyptic over Y 1.5K, like we were worked up over Y2K. They thought the world was coming to an end. Scientists and astronomers were beginning to question the established ideas that the earth was the center of the universe and the concept that the earth itself was flat. In the year before Luther posted his church dividing ideas in 1516, 500 years ago this year, Prince Wilhelm IV of Bavaria established the recipe for German beer, which has become the standard for German beer unto this day, only including 4 elements. Now, maybe it's time for a change, the craft beer makers are beginning to say, but the rule 500 years ago is the rule for German beer making even today. People are beginning to question that. Just like people were beginning to question things in Luther's time. It was more than Wilhelm IV who wanted to establish trusted patterns and consolidate power and quell dangerous ideas. The Medici family were the popes in those days, and if you remember how they ran the church, they amassed great wealth for the church and beautiful works of art, so that if you go to St. Peter's Basilica today, the foundation of which was laid in 1506, and Luther visited it when it was being built, you can understand the effect of the Medici popes. The building that was going to be built had to have a capital campaign, of course, to raise that building, a building that is much larger than a football field inside. For the period of time, it was an unprecedented kind of construction. People were questioning the authority of the church and its expansion. 100 years before Luther, a Hungarian reformer, Jan Hus, was put to death for questioning things in the church. He too was a professor. Islam was flexing its muscles in those days, even in Europe. The century of Luther's life was a rich and unstable time. Things were changing everywhere. There was a bubble of growing knowledge and technology that was beginning to change how everybody was living. Beliefs were shifting. Minds were changing. The era of the Middle Ages was fading, and the modern era was being born. Really not unlike the last century in which we have experienced similar sorts of dynamics. Martin Luther had been studying law but became an Augustinian monk and then a priest in the Roman Catholic Church. And he had questions and he had doubts and he had religious anxieties. His spiritual mentor assigned him to biblical studies to channel those energies around his tormented mind with the technicalities of, say, biblical languages and the specifics of biblical interpretation. It was really done just to distract this very busy mind. His questions, though, took on new shape as he began to read the Bible. Luther was 21 years old when he saw for the very first time a printed Bible. 21. He began to shape ideas, though. Why were things in the church, as he studied the Bible, why were things in the church so different than what was found in the Bible? Why were thoughts and foundational ideas so different? It was near the pinnacle of Luther's certainty that things were not the way they are supposed to be in the church that a priest arrived in Wittenberg who was there to raise the capital campaign for St. Peter's Basilica. He employed the worst, most manipulative types of methods to get money out of the folks in Saxony, now Germany. For a little cash, he said, he could promise the forgiveness of your sins. And he could promise that no matter where your dead loved ones were, their sins could be forgiven too, with just a small down payment and a few installments. It's unbelievable to us. Luther had had enough. Posted for public debate 95 ideas on the bulletin board of that era. Now, we make it a much bigger deal. We show him with a sledgehammer pounding it into the door of the church. But it was the bulletin board of the church of the day, and so he pins it up there instead of slamming it home the way we show it. And of course, he challenged the church. It was meant to be a polite debate, except he was a victim of his era. Gutenberg had invented something like social media. And because of the movable type printing press that was invented a few decades before Luther, everybody all over Europe knew what Luther was talking about. It was a surprise to Luther. No one had ever seen anything like it. Local princes, wanting to be free from the burden of taxation from Rome, sided with Luther and protected him. Rome was furious. The church split. They called Luther a heretic. Luther called the Pope the Antichrist. Politics, So those who followed Rome were part of the Roman Catholic Church, and those who followed Luther and other reformers, because he wasn't alone, were considered protesters, or as we're known today, Protestants, or Protestants. Lutheranism traces its history to that event. We are followers of the first Protestant, the first reformer. The beliefs of Luther and the Protestants stem from Luther's rejection of some of the major teachings of the Catholic Church, particularly how we are saved. And we even sang about it this morning, that we're made right, we're justified with God by grace through faith. Over time, differences of the Catholic Church and the Lutheran Church and Protestants were clearly divided. But over time, there's been less of a divide between some Protestants, including Lutherans, and Roman Catholics. In 1999, the Catholic Church and the Lutheran World Federation, representing nearly 70 million, or a little over 70 million Lutherans in the world today, agreed on the doctrine of justification, the thing that divided the church. There's a book published now on all the agreements between the Lutheran churches in the world and the Roman Catholic Church in the world. It seems as though we have more in common with the Roman Church than is not common between us. What seems to be happening is that we have less and less in common with the rest of Protestantism, or at least some versions of Protestantism. And that's confusing, isn't it? Because we are a Protestant church, and so all of the Protestants think that we should act like all of the Protestant churches, and yet what we have done is really stay closer to the first part of the Protestant Reformation. And sometimes Lutherans wonder why we don't act or believe like other Protestants. And there are really kind of four ideas that I want to spend a little bit of time unpacking this morning. I had to have 2 sermons today, so you get the longer one. Later we have confirmation, so they'll get the shorter version. They'll get 2 instead of 4. But they're really kind of 4 beliefs that set us apart from other Lutherans. I got this question the other day, first time in years, about predestination. So the first one is about being the elect, okay? Whereas some Protestant denominations focus on believers' decision to accept salvation from Jesus, Lutherans turn that around and we focus on God choosing the believer. Instead of God choosing a, 44,000 or 400,000 or a certain amount of people that will be saved, Lutherans believe that it's an act of God's grace for all people, that no one is really destined or predestined. It's not set up. It's not a rigged system for some people to go to hell. We believe that God intends salvation for all people, but some people will choose otherwise. And if you look around you and you look into the lives of other people, and sometimes even your own, you understand how you've chosen hell, even hell on earth. The second is the role of good works. So the first was the elect. The second is the role of good works. Now, we steadfastly believe that salvation can never be earned. Now, we're not opposed to good works or hard works. We're just opposed to them earning anything. And that makes a huge difference in the way in which we present ourselves in the world, because there are holiness movements in Protestantism that believe that we should be moving towards some sort of holiness. And in that, there is a slippery wicket of somehow being better than other people by being more holy than other people. In other words, earning it slides in there somehow. A common Lutheran saying states, God doesn't need your good works, but your neighbor does. Okay? So the emphasis is the Lutheran conviction that just because God alone is capable of our salvation doesn't mean that we are not supposed to do something. As we read the Bible, we look at it as a book that tells us how to have our neighbor's best life. And if everybody's functioning in that way, you have a pretty good neighbor, and you have a pretty good neighborhood, and you have a pretty good city, and so forth. The third thing is paradoxes. Now, this is the most difficult thing for modern-day Lutherans because of the effect of the rest of Protestantism, which tries to make things so crystalline clear and so simple. Just 4 little statements and the believer's prayer or the sinner's prayer, and it's all taken care of. We believe strongly in paradox. So some people claim that Lutherans and Lutheranism is a religion of ands. Okay? For instance, Lutherans believe that people are both bound by sin and by death, but are not bound and are freed because of Christ's death and resurrection. We're freed from sin and its consequences, both and. Another common belief balances justice and mercy, that people are both subject to condemnation of the law and yet redeemed from that condemnation through the mercy of God. We are simultaneously sinners and saints. I used to greet you more regularly with, "Good morning, sinners," and you'd all be like, "Yes," and "Good morning, saints," and "Hello." That is a Lutheran idea, that at the same time, in the same person, not between people, is sinner and saint. It's within the same person. The understanding of ourselves is that we are both and, that we can be a glorious saint, and yet we can also be a notorious sinner. These things are true about the human life, the both and. And as we read the Bible, we encounter law or God's demand. In every passage, we would encounter what God's asking of us, God's law, or the gospel, the free gift of God's grace offered to us in every passage of Scripture. We would see both and, demand and grace being offered. The kingdom of God, heaven, is an already and yet not yet fully revealed experience. In other words, Lutherans don't make heaven the aim of our project. You probably know lots of Protestants who make the aim heaven, that the goal is to check the boxes so that we're secure in heaven. That is not the Lutheran idea. The kingdom of heaven, what Jesus taught about, is something that's already present, that you can begin to participate in. And your life can, just like you can choose to live a living hell, you can also choose to be living by the rule and cadence of heaven. And that begins today as we put ourselves or subject ourselves to what God desires in our lives. But it will never be fully revealed. We won't build it. We won't create it. We're not a utopian society. Lutherans weren't ever very good at that. We understand that it will be revealed as God's gift at one point in the future. Paradox, and finally, worship. If you're a regular 8:30 person, maybe you don't have this sense, but if you're a 11 o'clock person, you get a sense that unlike Protestant churches, Lutheranism retains the outward symbols and the liturgical structure of the Roman Catholic Church and Judaism that predates them. For instance, most of us have altars, pulpits, fonts. If you went to Calvary Community Church this morning, would you find these things? No, they don't have them. They might have a temporary version of it, but they wouldn't have those sorts of things. If you were at our late service, you would see me dressed very differently than this very dapper suit. I'd have a very dapper robe on, an alb, in fact, looking very different than other Protestant congregations who focus their attention on academic achievement of their clergy. We wear white albs like Roman Catholic priests, focusing on humility or the equalization of you don't know that I have a dapper suit on underneath this, or I have torn jeans. Lutheran churches are not bound by a central authority so that we don't have to do those things, and yet many of us continue them like our congregation. And so you can find differences between Lutheran congregations as well because of the lack of a centralized idea. Even the 70 million organization folks don't really set policies. They talk about relief efforts in the world. So today, as we celebrate a divide in the church, I've always found it odd that we would celebrate a schism. We would also work to repair and bridge the division between Lutherans and other churches, including the Roman Catholic Church today. And we can be proud of our heritage, even as we work to resolve the causes of the division that our heritage has resulted in. Lutherans bring a deep theological reflection and tradition with an honest but hopeful assessment of human life and an undying commitment to demonstrating and trusting in God's grace alone, while at the same time striving for justice so that all people can be included in such grace. So in honor of the Reformation, as you go about your work this week, think of some way that you and your commitment to grace can be a bridge builder, because that's what Lutheranism's heritage really is. Even though we were the first schismatic movement, we are the most profound bridge builders in world Protestantism today. So how can you begin to build bridges with people of other Christian traditions? Instead of flailing around that they're the Antichrist and that they're a heretic or you are, maybe look at ways in which you can bridge between those two, because there's enough of that other stuff in the world today, not just in American politics. Or how can you be a bearer of God's grace, committed to keeping the good news of God's love always good news for everyone, even for those who believe they are beyond God's mercy, or even for those who believe that they don't need God's mercy. So let us live into the best of what the Reformation is about, I'm encouraging. Even as God seems to be reforming the church, and undoubtedly things are being reformed in the American church experience, and it will be a very different century. But I think it'll be a very hopeful quincentenary, which is the 500th anniversary, of course. I think the next 500 years will be revealing great ways in which God has reformed his church for the mission of his world. It's always hopeful, folks. That's really Luther, is despite the fact that he had some really negative things to say as he was dividing up the church, he was always very hopeful. So my favorite quote of Luther is, Father Luther, if you knew the world was going to come to the end today, what would you do? Anybody remember? Plant a tree. Think about the paradox of that. In other words, there's always hope. So let us be hopeful protesters, bridge building Protestants, so that the world might be able to experience the flow of God's grace, mercy, and peace in the world.